Are you serious, Chief? Is this some kind of joke? Colonel Eva Rostova's voice, sharp and strained, cut through the low hum of the hangar. It was a cathedral of military power, a vast climate-controlled cavern built to house a god of the sky. And the god was sick. Before her, the B-2 Spirit bomber, callsign Spirit of Missouri, sat inert and monolithic, its black flying wing shape absorbing the light and the hope of every technician on the floor. For 3 weeks, the entire B-2 fleet, the nation's most critical strategic asset, had been grounded. 3 weeks of failed diagnostics, of swapped-out components, of mounting pressure from the Pentagon. And now, her Chief Master Sergeant had brought her this, an old man. He stood near the massive portside landing gear, a ghost from another era. He wore a faded, dusty red civilian work jacket, the kind you'd see on a farmer or a small-town handyman, layered over a simple heather gray t-shirt. His hands, wrinkled and stained with the memory of 1,000 other engines, were tucked into his pockets. He wasn't looking at the frantic ballet of airmen and engineers with their glowing laptops and diagnostic tablets. He was looking at the plane. Rostova strode across the polished concrete floor, her OCP boots making sharp, authoritative clicks that echoed in the tense silence. The airmen parted before her, their faces a mixture of frustration and weary respect. She was the 509th Maintenance Group commander, the woman responsible for keeping these billion-dollar birds in the air. The failure was hers, and the weight of it had compressed her usual command presence into a brittle, dangerous edge. She stopped a few feet from the old man. He didn't seem to notice her. His gaze was fixed on the complex joint where the landing gear met the wing, an intricate nexus of hydraulic lines and actuators. "Sir," Rostova's voice was firm, stripped of all pleasantry. "This is a restricted area. I need to see your authorization." The old man slowly turned his head. His eyes were pale blue, clouded by age but holding a deep, unnerving stillness. He looked at her uniform, at the silver eagle on her collar, and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. He wasn't intimidated. He wasn't even impressed. He just was. "Don't have any," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "Just came to look." "Just came to look," Rostova repeated, an incredulous laugh threatening to break through her control. "This isn't a museum. This is an active flight line, and you are standing next to a grounded piece of vital national security. Who are you?" A young, eager lieutenant stepped up beside Rostova. "Ma'am, security is on their way. We don't know how he got this far." Rostova held up a hand, silencing him. She kept her eyes locked on the old man. The situation was an embarrassment on top of a crisis. A civilian, an old one at that, had wandered into the heart of her command during its most vulnerable moment. The crowd of onlookers was growing. Technicians, weary from their 18-hour shifts, had stopped working to watch the bizarre confrontation. It was a distraction, but it was also a spectacle. "I'm going to ask you one more time, sir. Who are you, and what are you doing here?" The man finally pulled a hand from his pocket and gestured with his chin toward the B-2. "Heard you had a ghost in the machine. A pressure leak you can't find." Rostova's jaw tightened. It was the precise problem. A transient hydraulic pressure drop in the primary landing gear deployment system. It only happened under specific aerodynamic loads, impossible to replicate perfectly on the ground. Every diagnostic had come back clean. They had x-rayed the lines, swapped 3 different actuators, and run terabytes of data through modeling software. Nothing. The plane was, for all intents and purposes, perfect and perfectly useless. "That's classified information," she snapped. "Isn't classified if the machine tells you itself," the old man said, his eyes going back to the landing gear. He took a slow step closer, ignoring the invisible line of military authority Rostova had drawn around herself. He ran a single gnarled finger over a hydraulic coupling, his touch gentle like a doctor checking for a pulse. "With all due respect, old-timer," the young lieutenant interjected, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have the most advanced diagnostic tools in the world. I think we know more about this aircraft than you do." The old man didn't even look at him. He just kept his gaze on the machine. "Your tools can't see memory," he murmured, more to the plane than to anyone else. "They can't see the stress of 1,000 landings. The metal remembers." Rostova had had enough. The condescension from her own officer was irritating, but the folksy wisdom from this trespasser was infuriating. It felt like a mockery of her and her team's exhaustive scientific efforts. "I want your ID. Now," she commanded, "and then you will be escorted off my flight line." The man sighed, a weary sound, and reached into the inner pocket of his red jacket. He pulled out a worn leather wallet, cracked and softened with age. He fumbled for a moment before producing a driver's license. The plastic yellowed and scuffed. He handed it to her. Rostova took it, her gaze clinical. Charles Lindberg. The name was absurd, a historical echo that felt like part of a prank. Born 1938, address somewhere in rural Missouri. She looked from the photo of the smiling younger man on the ID to the weathered face before her. As she did, her eyes caught on a detail on his jacket she hadn't noticed before. On the right breast, nearly invisible against the faded red fabric, was the ghost of a patch. The threads were almost all gone, but she could just make out the shape, a shield in a fist clutching a lightning bolt. It was the insignia of the Strategic Air Command, SAC, disbanded in 1992. It was a relic, as obsolete as the man wearing it. A flicker, unbidden, flashed through her mind. Not a memory, but an image, sharp and vivid. The roar of 8 jet engines on a cold Dakota morning, the smell of burnt kerosene and freezing steel. She saw a pair of young hands, not yet wrinkled but already calloused, expertly tightening a fuel line on the wing of a B-2, the red fabric of a jacket sleeve stark against the winter sky. The hands belonged to a young man with pale, determined eyes. The image was gone as quickly as it came, leaving behind a faint, inexplicable sense of connection, of a history she couldn't place. She shook it off, dismissing it as a stress-induced phantom. She handed the ID back with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Mr. Lindberg, your presence here is unauthorized. You need to come with me." "He ain't hurting nothing, ma'am," a voice said. Rostova turned. It was Chief Master Sergeant Davis, the man who had first alerted her. He stood a respectful distance away, his face a careful mask of neutrality, but his eyes were fixed on Lindberg with an expression Rostova couldn't decipher. It wasn't pity. It was something closer to awe. "Stay out of this, Chief," Rostova warned, her voice low. The humiliation was peaking. Here she was, a full colonel, commander of a vital maintenance group, being sidetracked by a lost senior citizen while her career and her country's security hung in the balance. The murmurs from the crowd of airmen grew louder. They were watching her, judging her, unseen by Rostova, whose attention was locked on Charles. Chief Davis slowly backed away. He kept his eyes on the scene, on the old man now running his bare hand along the length of a thick hydraulic line, his head cocked as if listening to a secret. Davis pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket, his movements economical and discreet. He shielded the screen with his body and scrolled through his contacts, his thumb stopping on a name listed only as G. Miller. He pressed the call button and lifted the phone to his ear, turning his back to the drama. "Sir, it's Davis, at Whiteman," he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. "You're not going to believe this. They're about to throw an old man out of the B-2 hangar." "No, sir. That's why I'm calling." Davis paused, listening. "Yes, sir. He's wearing that old red jacket you told me about." "Yes, sir. The name on his ID is Lindberg, Charles Lindberg." A beat of silence. "Yes, sir," Davis said, a hint of relief entering his voice. "I understand. I'll keep them occupied." He hung up, his face grim but resolute. He knew that a phone call had just been made that would shake the very foundations of the base. The cavalry was coming, and Colonel Eva Rostova was standing on the wrong side of history. Inside a quiet wood-paneled office overlooking the Potomac River, retired General Marcus Miller, a 4-star legend who now served as a senior civilian advisor to the Air Force, slammed his phone down into its cradle. His normally placid, grandfatherly face was a mask of thunderous urgency. "Janet," he roared, his voice shaking the crystal decanters on his credenza. His executive assistant, a woman who had seen him brief presidents without breaking a sweat, rushed in, her eyes wide. "Sir, get me the Secretary of the Air Force on my secure line. I don't care if he's in a meeting with God. You tell him General Miller has a broken arrow situation, and while that's connecting, get me the base commander at Whiteman Air Force Base. His name is Brigadier General Peterson. Find him. Now." Janet flew out of the room, the commands echoing behind her. Miller paced his office, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind racing. Charles Lindberg, after all these years. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in a decade, but the legend was burned into the institutional memory of everyone who had ever worked on the B-2 program. They called him the Ghost of the Skunk Works, the mechanic of the impossible. He was a civilian engineer from the original Northrop team in the 80s, a quiet, brilliant man who saw machines not as collections of parts but as living things. He had designed the B-2's notoriously complex hydraulic systems, not on a computer but on a drafting board, with a slide rule and an intuition that bordered on supernatural. His name was on a dozen classified patents for the alloys and seals used in its construction. He had retired 20 years ago, vanishing back into the Missouri landscape from which he came. "General Peterson on line 2, sir." Janet's voice came through the intercom. Miller snatched the phone. "Peterson, this is Miller. I don't have time for pleasantries. You have a civilian in your main B-2 hangar. His name is Charles Lindberg. Is that correct? There was a stunned silence on the other end. General, I have no idea. I'm in a planning brief. Then get out of your brief, Miller commanded, his voice cold as liquid nitrogen. Your entire B-2 fleet is down because of a hydraulic ghost your people can't find. And the man who designed that system, the only man on Earth who knows its secrets, is standing in your hangar right now. And I have it on good authority that your maintenance group commander is about to have him arrested for trespassing. You will go down to that hangar. You will find Mr. Lindberg, and you will give him anything he asks for. Am I clear, General? Crystal, sir. Peterson's voice was now tight with alarm. I'm on my way. Back in the hangar, the atmosphere had grown thick with unspoken tension. Rostova had received a curt, inexplicable message from the command post. Hold your position. Do not remove the civilian. Await instruction. The order made no sense. It was a direct contradiction of every security protocol she had ever known. The delay only frayed her nerves further. The old man, Charles, seemed oblivious. He had knelt down, his old knees cracking, and was now peering into the dark recesses of the wheel well, his brow furrowed in concentration. This was the final indignity. Her authority was being questioned by some invisible hand, all because of this relic. She made a decision. Protocol or not, she had to restore order. All right, that's it, she said, her voice dangerously quiet. I'm done with this circus. She turned to the nearest security forces airman, a young sergeant with a nervous expression. Sergeant, I am ordering you to escort this man to the security building. We'll sort this mess out there. The sergeant looked from his superior officer to the strange, calm old man and back again. He took a hesitant step forward. Ma'am. But before he could finish, a new sound cut through the hangar. Not a siren, but the distinct, urgent squeal of tires on pavement, followed by the authoritative slam of heavy car doors. Every head turned towards the massive hangar entrance. A black command vehicle, a government-issue SUV with darkened windows, had pulled to a stop just inside, flanked by a security forces patrol car, its lights flashing silently. The rear door of the SUV flew open, and out stepped Brigadier General Peterson, the wing commander. He wasn't wearing a flight suit. He was in his full-service dress, his chest a constellation of ribbons. His face was set like granite. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the grounded B-2. He strode past Colonel Rostova with a single clipped colonel that felt like a physical blow. His eyes were scanning the scene, searching. He spotted Charles, still kneeling by the landing gear. The general's pace quickened. The entire hangar held its breath. The airman, the lieutenant, Rostova herself all stood frozen, watching the unthinkable unfold. General Peterson did not stop until he was 5 feet from the old man in the faded red jacket. Charles slowly looked up from his inspection, his blue eyes meeting the general's, and then in the cavernous silence of the hangar, Brigadier General Peterson, commander of the most powerful airbase on the planet, snapped to attention. He raised his right hand in a salute so sharp, so perfect it seemed to slice the air. Mr. Lindberg. The general's voice was loud, clear, and ringing with a profound respect that bordered on reverence. It is an honor to have you here, sir. The sound of that single statement hit the room like a shockwave. Jaws literally dropped. The smirking lieutenant's face went white. Chief Master Sergeant Davis allowed himself a small private smile, and Colonel Eva Rostova felt the concrete floor fall away beneath her feet. It was as if the world had turned upside down. The chain of command, the rigid structure that had defined her entire life, had just been inverted by a single impossible salute. Charles looked at the saluting general, then slowly, with the creak of old bones, he rose to his feet. He gave a simple nod. General. Peterson dropped his salute, but remained at attention. He turned to face the stunned crowd of airmen, his gaze sweeping over them before landing, with palpable weight on Colonel Rostova. For those of you who do not know, the general began, his voice booming in the acoustically perfect space. Let me introduce you to a living legend. This is Mr. Charles Lindberg. He was a senior civilian engineer with Northrop's Advanced Projects Division in the 1980s. When the team developing the B-2 was faced with an unsolvable vibration issue in the hydraulic manifolds, an issue that threatened the entire project, it was Mr. Lindberg who solved it. When the prototypes were showing stress fractures that no computer model could predict, it was Mr. Lindberg who redesigned the load-bearing alloys by hand. He took a step closer to Charles. The crews at Palmdale had a nickname for him. They called him the Ghost. He would appear when a problem seemed impossible, fix it with an intuition that defied explanation, and disappear just as quietly. His name is on the original patents for the very hydraulic actuators you have been struggling with for 3 weeks, Colonel. He didn't just work on the B-2. In many ways, he built it. A wave of whispers rippled through the airmen. They were no longer looking at an old man. They were looking at a titan, a founding father of the very technology they served. They saw the faded red jacket not as a sign of poverty, but as a holy relic. They saw the grease-stained hands not as unclean, but as the instruments that had shaped their world. Rostova felt a hot flush of shame creep up her neck. Every dismissive word, every impatient gesture, replayed in her mind, now cast in the horrifying light of her own ignorance. General Peterson's gaze finally settled on her, and it was as cold and unforgiving as the stratosphere. "Colonel," he said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous tone, "you have access to $1 billion worth of diagnostic equipment. You command hundreds of the most brilliant, highly trained technicians in the United States Air Force. What you seem to have forgotten is that these machines have a soul, put there by the men who created them. You had the one man on Earth who could commune with that soul standing right in front of you, and you were about to have him thrown out." He let the words hang in the air, a public indictment of her failure. "We will be having a conversation about your judgment, Colonel, a very long one." The career-ending implication was unmistakable. But before Rostova could even begin to process the collapse of her world, Charles Lindberg spoke. His voice was quiet, but it carried an authority that now silenced everyone. "It's not her fault, General," he said, looking at Rostova with an expression not of pity, but of understanding. "The world is different now. You all learned to trust the screens. You see the numbers, the data, the green lights and the red ones. It's a good way to see, but it's not the only way." He turned and placed his hand back on the landing gear strut, his palm flat against the cold black metal. "I see the memory. I feel the ghosts of 10,000 hours of flight, of 1,000 hard landings in crosswinds. The machine was telling a story your computers weren't programmed to hear." He pointed to a small, seemingly insignificant valve assembly, half hidden behind a bundle of wiring. "It was hurting. Right here." As his finger rested on the valve, a final, crystal-clear image bloomed in Rostova's mind, a flash echo from the past. It was a brightly lit, clean room in the California desert. Decades ago, a younger, dark-haired Charles Lindberg stood before a blueprint, surrounded by engineers in white lab coats. He was pointing to the exact same valve assembly on the paper. "The simulation is wrong," his younger voice insisted. "The thermal stress cycles will cause a microcrystallization in the polymer seal right here. It will be undetectable under static pressure, but it will weep fluid under a high G load." The engineers had shaken their heads, pointing to their computer printouts, dismissing his concerns. The image faded, leaving Rostova with the chilling certainty of his words. He had known. For 30 years he had known this day would come. The fallout was immediate and decisive. Following Charles Lindberg's guidance, the maintenance crews bypassed the faulty valve. He directed them to a specific panel on the inner wing, where, just as he'd described, they found a minuscule, hair-thin fracture in a secondary reservoir seal, a flaw created by the very pressure leak the valve was supposed to contain. It was a problem that could only be found by someone who knew the system's cascading points of failure by heart. Within hours, Spirit of Missouri was certified airworthy. Within a week, the entire B-2 fleet was retrofitted with a newly machined component, designed by Charles on a notepad he pulled from his jacket pocket. A formal investigation was launched into Colonel Rostova's command, but General Peterson, influenced by Lindberg's quiet defense of her, made it an inquiry not of punishment, but of learning. The result was not a reprimand, but a revolution. A new training directive, officially designated Air Force Manual 21101B, but known by everyone as the Lindberg Protocols, was instituted across Air Force Global Strike Command. It mandated hours of intuitive diagnostics, teaching young technicians to use their senses to listen to the sounds of a machine, to feel for unusual vibrations, to understand the history and personality of the specific aircraft they worked on. About a month later, Eva Rostova, now humbled and introspective, was sitting in a small coffee shop in the nearby town of Warrensburg. She was in civilian clothes, trying to feel anonymous. She heard the small bell above the door jingle and looked up. Charles Lindberg was walking in, his faded red jacket a familiar sight. He ordered a black coffee and, turning from the counter, saw her. For a moment she tensed, expecting awkwardness or accusation. He simply smiled, a small, kind crinkle at the corners of his eyes. He walked over to her table. "Colonel," he said with a nod. "Mr. Lindberg," she replied, her voice quiet. "Please, it's Eva." "Charlie, then," he said, pulling up a chair. "This is a good place, quiet." They sat in silence for a moment, the smell of coffee between them. "I wanted to apologize, Charlie," Eva said, finally meeting his gaze. "For my conduct, for my blindness." He took a slow sip of his coffee. "Nothing to forgive. You were doing your job as you knew how. Sometimes The hardest thing to do is to see what's right in front of you, especially when you're looking for something complicated. He looked out the window at the passing cars. People forget that the most advanced things in the world are still built by human hands. They all have a little bit of a soul in them. You just have to be quiet enough to listen to it. The story of Charlie Lindberg and the grounded B-2 became a quiet legend at Whiteman Air Force Base, a powerful reminder that wisdom isn't always found on a screen, and that the greatest strength can come from the most unassuming places. If you were moved by this story of unassuming valor, please like this video, subscribe to Veteran Valor, and share it with someone who appreciates the quiet heroes who walk among us.